Hello, Prof.
Hello.
Hello. So it's almost midnight over there, isn't it?
No. It's early evening. It's 7:30 p.m.
Oh, 7:30 p.m. Okay.
or 9:30 international time. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Welcome, Prof. I think we can start right now. Prof. Can we start right now, or we wait until 9:30? 3 more minutes.
Well, I hope everyone's going to open up their screen so I can see them.
Okay. For all the participants, please open your screen. Yeah.
And how would you like to run the conversation?
I think it will be only divided into two sessions. The first one is like a sharing session from you, and after that there will be like Q&A session. Is that all right?
I'm not quite sure I understand.
Okay, the first one is the presentation maybe or sharing session from you.
Oh,
and
okay.
after that there will be a Q&A session.
Okay, that'd be just fine.
Yeah. So Prof. Mazmanian, this webinar is collaboration between Development Study Club of University of Erlangga and Institut Pemerintahan Dalam Negeri, or Governmental Institute of Home Affairs, the institution under the Ministry of Home Affairs of Indonesia.
So I have a question to start my introduction.
Okay.
How did you arrive at asking me to have this conversation with you? How did you come to this?
Yeah, because you are really like renowned scholar for all of us here in Indonesia. A lot of like researchers and also like lecturers cited your published paper articles. So that like, okay, would like to invite you to share about your experience in doing your project or research, something like that.
Well, thank you. And I have to confess, I'm surprised. Until this evening, I didn't know you were reading any of my work or anybody at all knew anything.
Oh, you're really famous here, Professor. Really?
So I'm flattered in any event. So for those of you who don't know me in detail, I have spent my professional career as an academic studying environmental policy and goes a long ways back in studying California, which is where I live, because California is a premier state within the United States in pursuing very aggressive and demanding environmental policies in air, water, land use, and so forth. So that has been one of my major focuses, but also US policy. But the last 15, 20 years almost, I've really gone beyond that, looking at the questions of international environmental policy. I actually have been on 3 major commissions in China, looking at Chinese environmental policy, going back to the establishment of the Chinese National Environmental Policy Administration, and also sustainability internationally, but in particular in the United States, in California, in my own hometown of Los Angeles, California, and in my university. So that's where I come to this conversation. And by the way, since you're a university audience, I will share with you that about my experience at my own university, which is the University of Southern California. And I want to clarify, many people who don't know the difference between that and what's called the UCLA, which is the University of Los Angeles, University of California at Los Angeles. The University UCLA is a public institution with campuses across the state of California. And the University of Southern California is a private university. Other than that, we're both in Los Angeles, both huge, well-known, I believe, international universities, and both very competitive with one another. So that's where I come from this. But at USC for the last 3 years, I've been the chair of the University of Southern California's Presidential Working Group on Sustainability in Education, Research, and Operations. So I've actually immersed myself going well beyond policy to implementation and implementation of some rather dramatic changes at our own university, so that, as our president says, we are trying to walk the talk about sustainability and its challenges to all of us. So in that context, but let me just begin just a couple of words, because I'm really interested in your questions, which will take us as far as as you'd like. That my background is, in the first instance, my formal degree is in political science.
Okay.
And I began my research in Washington, D.C. at something called the Brookings Institution, but in a research institute for several years before I came to the university system. Prior to coming to the University of Southern California, I was the dean of it's called the School of Natural Resources and Environment at the University of Michigan, in Michigan, which is now, by the way, renamed to the School of Sustainability and Environment.
Okay.
And at USC, though, back to the last 3 years, we have a new president, and she believed deeply that we all had to walk the talk. So sustainability at USC is not about environmental science. It's not about equity and justice. It's not about carbon emissions. It's about everything. So sustainability at USC is defined as understanding the existential threat of climate change through every field and school that we have at USC.
I see.
And I mentioned that as the context of what I'm going to say about environmental policy, building on the questions I was asked and so forth, that it's something that we are all responsible for. And that's what the university assumes now in education, research, and operations. There's a story there its own, but I'm not going to talk more about it, except that's my most recent activity in this arena, trying to transform my home institution. About what the problem is, there was some comment about why are we studying environmental policy? That was one of the questions. You know, I'm going to try, and by the way, I'm going to try and see if I can remove myself. I am seeing only myself, not you. How can I lower this picture that only shows me and not you? There we go. Thank you. Because I want to open this up to comments and questions. But I don't know how much you've studied environmental policy, and in particular, I think the most vivid example of it today in terms of affecting you and me and everyone on the planet is climate change, because of the existential threat it presents to us. But rather than explain what it is per se, I have a question, but it's a suggestion. The International Panel on Climate Change is the world's leading organization understanding, tracking, and looking at policy options that affect us all. So if you have not, the best way to understand what the challenge is to read the synthesis reports or the detailed reports of the IPCC, which is the United Nations designated convening, it's called the COP, the convening of the participants, looking at climate change as it affects you and me and everyone else on the planet. And in fact, they're coming out with a synthesis report that is going to focus on the current state of and trends in the effects of climate change on us all, the long-term effects and the near-term effects. So from a policy point of view, which I'm involved in, the question becomes, well, what do you do about it? In other words, the challenge is laid out by the natural scientists in the IPCC and others. And the question for you, I hope, is, well, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it in Indonesia? Just as I asked, what am I doing about it in my own university, my own state, and my own country? What are we going to do about it? Can I ask a question before I go on?
Yeah.
The question is, what do you see? Others can speak out. I don't know what your protocol is. Raise your hand or speak out. What is the greatest threat in this existential issue from climate change facing Indonesia?
Okay. Is there any participants wants to answer the question from Professor Daniel? Okay. Okay, I think Aldivon will ask question because you raise your hand. Aldivon, you can talk. What is the biggest threats of climate change issues in Indonesia?
His name is maybe mistaken. I don't raise my hand. Maybe. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. Maybe from Mrs. Ruth.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Wike. Good morning from here, Professor. Can you hear my voice, Miss Wike?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, before I come to the explanation, I would like to talk to you. I'm now studying about our climate governance in Indonesia now. So the biggest threat in Indonesia now is a flood, Professor. So we have a very high rainfall in Indonesia that we cannot predict when it will come. So in Indonesia now, actually we have settled climate policy, and we have that climate policy have been integrated into development planning policy. So if from my insight, our biggest threat in Indonesia is flood, Professor, in everywhere, in every city in Indonesia. Thank you, Professor. I hope this answer can give you some insight about our country.
It does, but are others who see other parts of this issue that affect especially Indonesia? Any others?
Okay. Is there any other answers from all the participants? Okay, Nur Saribulan.
Not hearing that, if I may, let me share with you what I thought the answer would be. Knowing I'm not in Indonesia, I've never been to your country, but looking at the information about Indonesia that I did look into, as I understand it, Indonesia is made up of 17,000 islands, right?
Okay.
So what's the greatest threat? My suspicion is you would say sea level rise. I live in California. I live very close to the shore and the Pacific in California. And the greatest threat to California, a lot of people say it's X, Y, and Z. Aside from the existential part of it, which is the changing climate, but what's actually affecting California? Well, we have 11,000 miles of coastline, all up the Pacific, and it's sea level rise, because much of that coastline has already been settled. People live there, industry lives there, communities live there.
Yeah.
And so I thought maybe with your really unusual situation of being a nation of islands, that might come up. But also it's the changing weather patterns, because you're not going to move your island. You're going to have to chase the weather, and that's water, and that affects all of us. In California, it's the snowpack, not just the rain, but the snowpack. So I asked that to put in the context of trying to find out what people are going to deal with as I look forward in that. And so in response to, well, what might you be thinking about? I had a few, I would call it principles, guiding principles out of my work and what I've seen that I want to share with you. One is, when we take a look at climate change, which is not just carbon emissions, it's many things. It's weather patterns changing, it's greater inequity, it's starvation for some, and maybe even abundance for others, depending on where you live on the planet. And in the United States, there's a great deal of conversation about adaptation. about how we, in fact, adapt. But we have what I call, and I think you do too, an enormous amount of sunken capital. We already all live, or hopefully you do, I do, live in a home.
Mhm.
We already have our patterns of roads laid out. We already have our utilities laid out. We already have people who don't want to change their life situation. We already have enormous pollution from automobiles.
Yes.
So we have to but the principle is, out of policy analysis, that's where I come back to this policy conversation. It's easier to act on sustainability going forward than correcting past practices. And I say that because in the United States, we're having enormous controversies over what are we going to do in California along our coastline for the people who already live there. And it is not an easy issue. We have in California a problem of water for agriculture, which is transmitted through enormous methods of moving water across the state, from the northern part, particularly to the southern part of the state. There's a sunken cost problems. We've already built that infrastructure. People already live in their homes. So in thinking about what you can do to change things, my advice from a policy point of view is think about what you need to do differently going forward, not past practices. Because people won't change unless they see success at what somebody else did, and that's going forward. Second one is the IPPC finding most recently, their most recent papers are arguing that the most effective thing we can do, is to tackle the challenges of our natural environment and protecting our natural environment. They argue that the cost of protecting our natural environment and enhancing it and improving it has a return of investment 29 times larger than if you're talking about changing, for instance, me out of my car. So that this is a global problem. Climate change is affecting every ecosystem on the planet. And so they want us as individuals living in urban areas, living in communities with other humans, I will call it the human civilization issue, the 7.5 going to 8 billion of us, to pay attention to the ecosystem we live on or live off of. That's the second thing in terms of thinking about policy, what needs to be done. For instance, in the oceans, we have no law of the sea that is adequate to protecting the fish in the oceans. A huge global issue. So they argue, think about protecting our ecosystems as a first order activity. Third, there's no getting around it from a policy point of view that we're going to be chasing our tail, which is going around in circles as things get more and more severe, if we don't address carbon emissions. CO2 emissions is the planet's challenge, because if you don't eliminate the dramatic increase in carbon emissions over the last 100 years, we don't reverse that dramatically, it's not only going to have a heat impact, which it will, but it's going to continue to change our ecosystems, our weather patterns. So even if we can adapt or modify in a certain area, several years later, it will be gone. In the United States, we have areas that have been designated as habitat zones. So the species can survive. It's a 1970s and 1980s environmental movement to protect species. Well, as the climate changes rapidly, we're finding that the literal land that we've designated to be protected is no longer serving the species that live there because it's getting too hot or too dry. So you can't migrate protected species areas, at least in my state because we've already developed around them. And the same thing with national parks and international parks. So it's easier to go forward than looking back if you want to make a difference in what we're doing. It's really critical to think about this as an ecosystems challenge, not a city's challenge, not my challenge or your challenge alone, but how we protect our ecosystem in which we live and live off of. And then we can never imagine success other than dramatic harm unless we reduce fossil emissions. And that raises all kinds of ethical questions of who's responsible for lowering. So I hope you know the question. I don't want to be insulting your intelligence of the answer, but who are the first and the second largest emissions of carbon emissions today?
China.
China's number one. Who's number two?
Maybe America, USA.
Yes. Over the last 30 years, it was reversed. We were the highest emitters. Now China's the highest emitters. That's because they've been growing so rapidly and doing so very much on fossil fuel. Why they are also the largest developers of solar, hydropower. They're moving into nuclear power. Still, their carbon emissions exceeds anybody else on the planet as a society. My question to you is, for the economic development of Indonesia, which I know is a critical concern for you and for people in Indonesia, what's your carbon footprint and what's it going to be in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? What it came out of, you may know this much better than I do, what came out of the Bali meeting earlier this year, held in Indonesia, Bali, on this whole question?
So the forest?
What was the assessment of what your government is currently doing to address climate change?
Okay, Mr. Professor, give you some insight about our climate policy now in Indonesia. Actually, we have now low carbon development policy in Indonesia. Have been integrated into our development planning policy, but it's still in the policy level. I think it is not until to the level side, and we know Indonesia have signed that Paris Agreement in IPCC, but 29% and 41%. So now we are have a very massive promotion about that carbon emission reduction in our all document policy, but we don't know until to the implementation.
Well, most countries on the planet have not met their IPCC promises.
Yeah, yeah.
So what we are facing is, even where we have ambitious policy, the realities of life are preventing nations from reaching their own ambitions. You can be cynical about this and say, well, they really didn't intend to. They did this because they want to be a good citizen in the United Nations. But I think it's more serious than people simply being cynical. I think everybody who tries to make a significant change, let me take reducing carbon emissions, finds it very difficult to do. And if you're a developing nation trying to catch up with China, let alone the United States and Europe, it's even harder because the question is where you're going to get your energy.
Yeah.
Because if you tell me that you're going to do it on natural gas or coal, I'm going to say that your country will not benefit from that in the longer run, and neither will anybody else. Once again, that goes back to you can't move forward without also thinking about the carbon emissions. And it's very difficult because currently it is more expensive than coal for those who have coal and natural gas for those who have natural gas. That's true in the United States. I mentioned earlier that California has been an environmental leader in the United States for many, many, many years. Have any of you heard that? Just raise your hand if you have that impression of California. Well, you don't have the impression of it, so it's not a problem. But the fact is, we're the fourth largest producer of oil in the United States. So in the midst of all kinds of clean air policies, land use policies, adaptation strategies, coming down on business very hard, we can't seem to escape the fact that we need oil because there are some 40+ million people in California. And despite the fact of all our rules and incentives to move to electric vehicles, and we have a lot of incentives to move to electric vehicles in California. And by the way, it is a very large market for electric vehicles. It's a minor 4 or 5% of the population that are driving electric vehicles right now.
Mm.
So even in a place where I would argue, I live in a place that as a state, as a community, as a university, we're all talking about being aggressive in this transformation. We're finding it very difficult. My own university has a carbon neutrality pledge for 2025. So we're committed to looking at our carbon footprint being carbon neutral by 2025, but we're not doing that with clean energy that we ourselves are generating. We're using cap and trade, we're purchasing it from others because we can't seem to move fast enough to redo all our buildings so they are not emitting natural gas, to relinquish using natural gas and substituting with electricity. It's very expensive to renovate a building anywhere in the world. So the sunken cost of my university is no different than the sunken cost of everybody on the planet who's done something and has something. It's hard. So that there's only 3 tools. There's only 3 policy tools to change the way we behave. 3 policy tools. This is my beginning public policy lecture format. 3 tools, and we come back to them for everything we try to do in terms of policy. One is government mandate, called regulations or laws and regulations saying you must. We don't say it'd be a good idea. Let me take the cars. California says you cannot drive. It doesn't say this, but if they want to use the mandated regulation and get us to electric vehicles, they would say you can no longer drive an internal combustion engine on the roads in California after 2035. That would be a mandate. That would be the law. You couldn't drive. Second policy tool is incentives. And that's actually what we're using. Incentives say, well, if you buy an electric vehicle today that costs more than the internal combustion engine, we'll subsidize the cost. The taxpayers will subsidize the cost. So we have our goals in California, very aggressive goals for zero emitting vehicles, but we don't say to everybody, if you don't, you can't drive. We say, and we're going to help you get there through incentives. That's what we do. This is the economic model. The economic model says you can get people to change their behavior if they see the incentives, the financial incentives, in their own interest. Now, I'm going to tell you that's not easy to do, even if I just told you we use incentives. Because what's happening in California is that the wealthy people are buying the EVs. It's a status symbol because they want to be good environmentalists and they can afford it. The less well off can barely afford to buy an old internal combustion engine car. Why? Because it's cheaper and it's used already. And so they buy a used one because otherwise they won't be able to actually feed their family. They can't afford an EV. So now we have to struggle with, well, who should the state government subsidize? The rich or the poor, or everybody the same? It's an issue every policymaker has to face, and there are different answers. California is trying to subsidize mostly the less well-off. Trying. It's still expensive to own. Third policy, so we have one strategy and policy tool, our kit. It's mandates and regulation. We have a second policy tool in our toolkit, which is incentives. Find a way to make it worth people's own self-interest to do something financially. Figure out what price it takes. How much is someone have to pay you to get out of your car and buy an electric vehicle? How many of you own cars or drive cars? Nobody drives a car?
Drives.
Anybody have a car? Well, then maybe you don't face the problem the way the United States and Europe and now China face, which is cars. Third policy tool. It's called moral suasion or persuasion. Moral suasion. Convincing people that they need to change their behavior for the good of themselves and everybody else in our civilization. Now, getting people to change their behavior in California when the problem was maintaining our forests in California or maintaining our wetlands in California, the people who paid the cost for that, Californians, received the benefits. We're in California. So moral suasion is part of being part of a community, and you identify with that community and you recognize you have a moral. This is sometimes about a religion, about what your religion, your faith tells you, your responsibility to other human beings is. Or it's simply about, you care about, in my case, I care about my children, but I care even more so about my grandchildren. Not that I love them more than my children, but they're going to be here longer. And the longer this existential threat affects us adversely as human beings in a society, the more likely my grandchildren are going to be even a more difficult situation than I am today, and even their parents are today, or will be in their parents' lives. My grandson easily will live into the 21st century. My granddaughter also. What is it going to be like them? Moral suasion is me, Dan, says, I have to be attentive to the problems I'm creating by the way I behave, how I live, what I do, what I support, what I think is good and right, because I have a moral obligation to them. So those are the only three tools you will have as a policymaker. Ever. It's tools and mandates, it's incentives, and it's moral suasion. They all take different effects, but that's it. That's the toolkit of the public policy world. And if you think of what's going on in your own country and so forth, ask yourself, hey, are they regulating us to do this? Or are they trying to incentivize us? Or are they simply trying to persuade us we have a moral obligation to our families, to our fellow citizens, to the world's populations to behave differently? That's it. So with that, I want to turn it over to questions about policymaking, how we change people's behavior, or anything else about the environment or sustainability, anything else you want to, I have to trust your interest to guide the conversation.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Daniel Mazmanian. Is there any of you guys wants to asking the question related to the our previous discussion? So I can say that from Prof. Daniel, there are 3 policy tools to change the way we behave. The first one is government mandate or regulation. The second one is incentive. And the third one is moral suasion. So if you want to ask the question, you can raise your hand. Okay, Prof, we've got 2 audiences who wants to ask the question. Please, Miss Nur Saribulan.
Okay, thank you. Hello, Prof. Mazmanian. My name is Bulan. I'm from IPDN. You say that there are 3 policy tools that you can make to influence the policy or change the behavior. The first one is about the government and incentives, and then persuasion. But in Indonesian case, we know that sometimes talking about the regulation and then they change the behavior, we deal with the economic challenge. I mean, when we want to pursue something to follow, let's say that do not do illegal logging, for example, but they need to fulfill their basic needs. So sometimes government have, like, if I could say, difficulties in choose whether we want to focus on the economic development. On the other hand, we should focus on the climate change. It's related with the policy about the nickel export. When Indonesia tried to stop the raw materials from sell the nickels for international trade, we have the controversial issue about that. And it's kind of something like in one side, Indonesian government tried to, let's say, want to make the additional income for our country, but on the other hand, it means that it will be caused into the climate change even worse. So what do you think about this? Because sometimes when we want to make the better policy,
I think this is a first of all, I understand that, and it's true for many places in the world, in different products, that they have a resource, a natural resource that they're selling for income to use over here. Hopefully they use it for good purposes over here, but sometimes they just put in their own pocket. But the fact is that's a real issue, because how do you raise the resources to make the change when all you have to sell is your natural resources, and once they're gone, first of all, you don't have a resource anymore, and secondly, that the very doing that creates more emissions. The only answer that I can give you to that is that requires a comprehensive governance of the resource. That is, Indonesia can't do that alone. Because if you said, well, we're going to stop cutting the trees, and that's a mandate, right? You will get others who say, but I can make a lot of money if I could cut a tree down and sell it to someone else, not even in Indonesia, on the international market. So the only way you can stop that is have an international accord that says we will not let that happen without some rules of how much wood can be cut and sold and where the money goes back to those who are paying the price for it by losing the wood in their society or need the income. And it's not easy. In fact, what climate change has made very clear is that the world of nation states we know is not adequate to dealing with the problem, because it doesn't matter where the carbon emissions occur, because it floats around the planet. The problem is not where the destruction has occurred. The problem affects all of us. So that part of the going forward, I want to come back to the IPCC and the United Nations, because we do not have a body worldwide that can mandate anything. Now, we're talking about simply one issue of products sold. I mentioned the law of the seas. The law of the seas is not preventing the over fishing going on in the seas in the Atlantic and the Pacific and Indian Ocean and everywhere else today. Why? Because we don't have any body that regulates for the good of everyone a viable extraction of fisheries that don't catch, because they die off the species. So we don't have regulations on that. So you need some combination of regulation and incentives and moral suasion about you have to do it. But that won't happen without an international regime. So if I was to start my career over again in studies, I would be studying international relations. I'm what's called an American political scientist, studying American and my state and my locals. But I don't think we're going to solve the climate change world without changing on how we understand internationally. We protect our ecosystems as a planet. We have to figure out how to incentivize those who are developing and facilitate their growth, because that's an equity and justice issue, while we're reducing carbon emissions. So that the problem you're identifying is, I think Indonesia, and others, is trapped in the old world.
Yes.
Because you're saying, well, we have to cut the trees down to get the...
Yes. It's very problematic, to be honest. Yeah, because in one side we talk about the economic development, and the other side we have the climate change problems.
Why did I will give the example of China? I told you I'd work with them. I was working with them in the environmental. They invited me and other international scholars to help them figure out what to do about their pollution back in the early part of the century, last 20 years, 1990s on. And what they were doing was digging and buying coal. Buying it and digging it in China and burning it. And they saw what happened in California, because we were very polluted from carbon emissions in California back. And Los Angeles dramatically squeezed out that emissions through technology, through banning certain facilities of getting energy, through rapid building of renewable energy. California did. So I was invited to China to talk with them about it. They said, how did you do that?
How long it takes to have the change, Prof?
It took 30 years.
30 years, all right. That's much.
Not in one day.
Yeah.
But my point about China, I said, why are you building all these fossil fuel plants when you've just seen what happened in Los Angeles when we did it? And the answer was unfortunately very clear. Coal's much cheaper. So if we're going to industrialize rapidly, we have to look at the economics on how can we build things cheaper, produce things cheaper than other people, so they will buy it internationally. That's how they got into the international market. Low paid labor, using polluting materials that were not being used in the EU or in the United States anymore. But they said, but that's the only way we're going to be able to grow rapidly in the world marketplace, because there was no international regulation of it. So I understand the dilemmas that are faced, but when we talk about solutions, it's mandates, it's incentives, and moral suasion, and you brought up scale. What's the scale of the regulation? Does it cover just Indonesia? Does it cover just the worst situations in Indonesia, or all of them? And in California, since we have 50 states, the history of environmental protection in California, in the United States, has often been state-driven. We have a system of tiered sovereignties. Sovereignty is the government of whatever it is, the area. In the United States Constitution, it's very clear the limitations of our national government. Everything else is up to the state. So California's had stricter laws than other states. That's how we did things other states have not even yet done yet in the United States. But you can't do that with carbon. It doesn't matter to people in California if the carbon comes from Nevada next to us, or Pennsylvania, or New York, or Indonesia, or China, or India, or Germany. It doesn't matter. That's why it's an existential threat. Containing it locally is not sufficient. So this is a governance issue But the governments that is going to be created, for which the United Nations is a beginning model, has only model. Their only tools will be mandates and regulation, incentives, and moral suasion. That won't change. The scale needs to change. We're on the brink on this planet right now of nuclear weapons being introduced in Europe. Russia has threatened nuclear weapons. They have them, and they've threatened to use them. There is no governing body that can go in and tell the Russians they can't do it. Now, the Russians have signed international accords saying that we will not initiate the use of nuclear power weapons and so forth. That's what the UN did. But there are accords that are only as good as the people or the governments that say they'll stick by them. There's no enforcing except moral suasion. So what's going on? And by the way, fear that we will retaliate. That's the MAD, mutually assured destruction. But what the United Nations has just done, 144 nations, is condemning Russia for what it's doing in Ukraine. 144 nations. Why? They're trying to persuade the Russians to back off. This is a problem with the scale of governance. We do not have a world, we have a world compact about nuclear power, nuclear weapons, and we have a world compact about carbon emissions. But there is no entity to enforce the compact except the people who are part of the compact. And that's a global challenge. So if you have an existential threat, like climate change, you have to have a governance mechanism at the same scale, and we haven't gotten there yet on this planet. I see other hands. I should turn to other pop. I hope that helps put that in context. So everybody's struggling without a governance system, how to curtail bad behavior. Bad behavior, in my view, is creating more pollution, not less. I see a couple of hands up here.
Yeah, please. I think the second
upper left
question
here.
will be from Hasti Lopuha.
Hesti, yeah. Go ahead, Hesti.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
First of all, thank you for the opportunity that given to me. Well, the first, if we talk about environmental, then one issue that's still happening in Indonesia, our country, is air pollution. Well, government of Indonesians has offered the solutions, like instead of using private transportations, we using the public transportations. The second, government still socializations about the not burning like trash in the public places. The third, reduce electricity using. The fourth, plants lots of plants in Indonesia. It's like that. But still, unfortunately, Indonesia still be the most polluting country in Southeast Asia. I just read your writing about the air pollutions, Los Angeles clean air saga spanning the 3 epochs, right, sir? It's about like the clean air, how the Californians give the solutions of that in the Towards Sustainable Community book, in Transitions and Transformations in Environmental Policy. Well, I really interested in that because Indonesians has the same issues. So, as you said before, toolkit of the public policy history, and the first one is government regulations. What governments in the California do to reduce the pollutions, and what the solutions that you can give to Indonesia's government to give and really good regulations so that air pollution can maybe reduce, or maybe Indonesians not to be the most polluting country in Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Well, first of all, you're right about the strategy. There are multiple parts of it, and it evolves over time. But about the burning trash, I grew up in my backyard. We used to burn our trash. when I was a little boy. Why? Why do we burn our trash? Because if you didn't burn it, you had to put it out on the street and a truck would come by and pick it up and haul it away.
Okay.
But they would charge my father a lot of money. So my father said, hey, we could just burn our trash. There's no one stopping us for that in our backyard. We don't have to spend that money. And then, and I was too young to say this, but if I was with my father when I was 7, person I am today, I'm older than 7, I would say, Dad, but we're affecting everybody else's air. And my father might say, well, listen, if they all stop burning and we don't, we just keep on burning, it's okay because it won't be enough to bother anybody. So that's called free riding. My father might say, hey, listen, let everybody else stop. That way we don't have to. Right? Or as people say in California today, let everybody else get that electric vehicle, then I won't have to. And so what you're talking about, so what happened? The state of California used regulation. It said, whoops, we can't have everybody free riding on burning in their backyard. It is against the law in California to burn in your backyard. Okay, we used regulation because we saw that problem could not be eliminated by moral suasion, and they didn't want to pay enough incentives, so they simply said you can't do it anymore. And we also now have laws that require 75% of our waste be recycled.
Yeah.
So we used regulations, but that law has taken 25 years to evolve.
Wow.
Because what you have to do is you have to, first of all, sort your waste, the different streams. 2, you have to get the waste management companies to develop the capacity to pick it up and treat it. And then we have composting now for food. There's now the law. So now we have to sort out the food waste or the biological waste, food and backyard waste, to the recyclable waste, to the waste that's left that is still today put in a dump, but you can't burn it. But that's a combination of the regulation. So, by the way, I believe that that's a function of wealth. That is, you can't impose on people who don't have enough money to get through the day or feed their family that they have to now stop burning their waste and recycle it, because that does cost money. So it's not an easy answer, but the air emissions problem is just like all the rest. Free riding, I call it free riding because you're going to let someone else do it. You don't have to do it yourself. You let someone else do it, what happens is a downward spiral typically. Because if my father kept burning in our backyard, someone a block away would say, well, the Mazmanians are doing it, so we're going to keep burning too. We're not going to pay the garbage. And then someone else will say it. So it has a way of unraveling. Unless the policeman came around and said, we see you're burning in your backyard. And you would say, how do you know it's us? Because we flew a drone over it and we see the drone pointing right to your garbage can. These aren't easy issues to solve, but you have to start somewhere. And the waste and the burning was the first thing the region did. It happens to be historically, because you could go after individuals and they understood what the problem was, and it was easy to detect. So you got to work that out yourself on that, what it could be. And then you have the incentives. Are you going to pay people to stop doing it? At the university I'm at, we play American football. You all know about American football, not soccer, but American football. We have a stadium that has about 80,000 people come to it every Saturday. I bet you don't follow USC football. We're doing very well, by the way. We have a football team. People come to a football arena, 80,000 of them. They buy drinks. They like food. They get a lot of stuff in paper wrapped and give it to them in boxes and bottles and so forth. It's 100% recyclable. How did we get a stadium for 80,000 people to be 100% recyclable, everything that goes on in that stadium? First of all, we told everybody who has a food stand, we are going to review what products you're using. You can't bring in products that can't be recycled. 2, we said we have different cans now. You'll see them as where you dispose of food left over, recyclable, not recyclable. You know what happens after that? It turns out people that go to watch our football games don't all pay attention or don't care. So if you say this is the recycling bin, they throw everything in it because, who's going to see it?
Yeah.
We have 24 people, a team of 24 people that comes in after the game and goes through every single garbage can and resorts. And if you do that, we end up with all but 7%. We call it 100% recyclable, but it's really 93%. All but 7% gets recycled, reused, repurposed. 7% still goes to a landfill. That's an enormous expense. Think about it. Paying people to come for 2 days and go through the garbage cans just for a stadium, and you control what's coming in to begin with. You can't bring food into the place or sodas into the place or things you want to sell, trinkets into the place before our own people inspect you before you come in. That's one stadium that made a commitment to it, and it's very costly. But it's a commitment the university made. So there's not an easy answer to this, except you have to find solutions that work for you. That is in Indonesia. And everybody can get on board with reducing air emissions. They prefer it, clean air. But then you've got to figure out how to stop it happening in ways that actually can be regulated without free riding. I see other questions. Oops, I just did something. There, I did it back. I see some questions and hands. I don't know who's regulating this, but
Okay. Please, Mr. Sutio, if you want to ask question to Prof. Daniel.
Thank you, Vika and Prof. Mazmanian. I hope my voice is listenable. Prof. Mazmanian, I am Sutio, lecturer in IPDN, and I am interested in the issue of rural studies and poverty alleviation. So, in my opinion, environmental policy should be made by prioritizing the livelihood of community, especially the poor itself. And my question is related to the issue of environmental policy, forest conservation, and livelihood of the rural people. Prof. Mazmanian, many post-colonized countries, in the name of forest conservation and environmental sustainability, in quote-unquote environmental sustainability, the state control all of the forest land. Even they hire the armed forest ranger. On the other side, community in rural areas are given almost no access to the forest. So community cannot benefit from the forest for their livelihood. And this institutional arrangement have two main implications. First is high poverty incident in the rural community, especially those located near the forest. And second is high incidence of land conflict involving the community, the state, and some private companies given usage rights to extract the forest. And these two consequences already happening in Indonesia for so long time. And for improving the livelihood of community near the forest, because I believe that environmental policy should be prioritizing the livelihood of community itself, it seems that we cannot rely on this centralized control of the forest. Yet, applying decentralization in forest management to local government is also not always the solutions. We in Indonesia applying decentralization since 2001, and the forest management is decentralized from the Ministry of Forest to district government. And various studies find the increasing deforestation, corruptions, and clientelism during the decentralization, because the local government also motivated to raise local revenues by extracting the forest. So decentralization doesn't always solve the problem and doesn't always give better result than centralized management. So my question is, based on your theoretical analysis and practical experience, what kind of policy tools that is applicable to deal with this issue, and at the same time can prevent the problem of the tragedy of the commons and the free rider in forest utilizations, because there are also many parts of our community that worry if we give the community the rights to control, to access, to manage the forest, then there will be the problem of the tragedy of the common in the forest utilization. That is my question, and I hope you can give me an answer to improve our understanding. Thank you, Prof.
Well, I appreciate that question. And by the way, it is not new, that issue, right? But it strikes me that what you defined is a problem of the allocation of the benefits and the appreciation of the long-term benefits of better forest management. Because I don't believe that the answer is to stop logging. The answer is, how do you have a regenerative forest process that the locals benefit from? Because as you said, if they have no say and they as a collection see no long-term payoff for sustainability of their community, then they have no incentives to avoid, if you will, the clear cutting and the other things that are going on. But you've touched on something else also, which is the dilemma. If you put it in the center, you might get a great policy, but a great deal of corruption at the local level. If you put it at the local level, people may not understand as well the cumulative impact of what they are doing. Yeah. So this is not just a policy issue, it's an education issue. Do you have examples? It's a question to you. Do you have examples of where communities live side by side with the forests, but are protecting it in a way that the yield is sustainable over time?
Yes, so far the example might exist in Indonesia, but the scale is very small scale. Yeah, see, for example, there is a village that has a forest, but the village forest is so small. If it is large enough, then it must be controlled by the state. Yeah. If it is small enough, the village can manage it. But if the forest is large enough, I don't know whether the community can manage it wisely and then benefiting for the livelihood, and at the same time also protecting it as in a sustainable manner.
This is a scale issue you're telling me now, the scale of what's feasible for the locals.
Yes, Prof.
Management. I don't have a simple answer to that actually at all, except if you take a look at consortiums of like-minded people, the technology and so forth is distributed through the consortium or the confederation of to get to scale. Because I understand what you're saying, and there's not a, I mean, you could say have more people, that makes no sense, or grow your community. That doesn't, I mean, people, that doesn't make sense, it seems to me. But how do you bring them together so they understand they have a common problem with a common solution that is a sustainable yield? Isn't that always the classic problem of free riding or exploiting, or, if you will, in many cases, a higher authority or a corporation that owns an awful lot, extracting the resource, but the benefit's not going back to the people? I don't have a simple answer to that one, but it seems to me it has to be a growing education process of multiple smaller communities effectively managing for sustainable yield.
Okay.
Thank you, Prof, for the answer.
Well, it's not a perfect answer, but it comes to mind.
Okay, Prof, do you mind if we go to the next question or?
Oh, please.
Okay, okay. So next question is from Mr. Advin Baidoa.
Thanks, Buike. Hi, Daniel. Nice to meet you. I have two very short questions. First, how the US deal with the politics in terms of producing a good environmental policy? Because in Indonesia, politics really matters on the environmental policy. And the second question, based on your empirical study at any country, under what conditions can a country be successful to formulate a good environmental policy? Thank you.
So my experience is related to democratic governance. That is one element, the formal process of democratic governance where people have a vote and it's one person, one vote, and institutions that respect that. By the way, sidebar, we have a process going on in the United States right now where the last president, Donald Trump, did not respect our democratic rules. But that's a big issue right now playing out this very day in the United States. But we've had 200 years of most people respecting that process. Two, interestingly, I told you I'm a Californian. I believe I told you that. I'm a native Californian.
Yeah.
I grew up as a young person spending time in the mountains, spending time at the ocean, spending time in beautiful landscapes. And I know what that feels like. So I think it's partly cultural. That is why did I become the dean of the School of Natural Resources and Environment? Because it's part of my value set, which is, I think that is important for all of us, but it's important for me personally too. And so there's a cultural dimension of California where, at least in the past, who knows about the future, but the last 70 plus years, which is when I've been around, they have been loud enough and concerned about the public good and the environment to mobilize. So the Sierra Club, NRDC, EDF, all these international now environmental groups, both national and international, most of them started in California because there was enough concern. And we had enough wealthy people who were committed to these causes who actually funded the nonprofit organizations. They don't continue to do so all their lives, but then you have to start with something. And we happen to have people who felt like I did, but were much richer, wealthier. And so if you take a look at the public opinion polls and support for the last 70 years in support of clean air, it's always been high. And so you follow politicians talking about we're going to pass laws to make sure we have clean air. And then you had people saying, well, you're going to run us out of business. But when we tried and pushed the policies for 4 or 5 years and the state's gross or state domestic product continued to grow, we're a growing state financially, it was very hard to say you couldn't regulate, incentivize, build the culture, and protect your environment. You could do all of that. But I understand that's California. In places where you do not have a representative governance process, we refer to the possibility of what's called an enlightened despot. I don't know if you know that term. It's in political theory. An enlightened despot is someone who actually is an authoritarian leader or has enormous power, and it is far less participatory in the citizenry in terms of democratic voting, but sees the value of protecting the community. That's the enlightened part. The problem is I don't know of many examples of enlightened despots. That's a theory. So the issue is it's power from the people or you will be exploited. You will be exploited for the near-term gains of others who aren't suffering the negative consequences. Yes, yes, yes. So it's a political challenge, isn't it? It's a mobilization of enough people to say no. Enough people to say, not only we're going to say no, but we actually have good technical reasons for arguing you can have both. You can have forestry, but you can have actually sustainable forestry. But you're not going to let all the wealth of generated go off and leave our country or go to some very small clique in our country. It has to be played back with the community. I don't have a better answer than that. I'm not a believer in enlightened estimates because everybody falls prey to greed and self-enhancement if given the opportunity long enough. Not everybody, every single person, but those who rise in the political arena seem to, more frequently than not. So environmental problems are political problems. But there are solutions.
Okay, how about that, Mr. Arvin? Are you satisfied enough?
Yes, thanks. Thanks very much, Daniel.
Okay, so the moral suasion is first we do the moral suasion to the policymaker first, or what, Prof. Daniel? If I can ask the question, because the first tool that you talked before is government mandate, right? So how about like the moral suasion of the policymaker first?
I don't know that these are sequential. That is, I'm not sure what comes first. I think what happens is outrage comes first about the problem, or fear about the problem. That's what I mentioned when I started way back now, an hour ago, said I thought the concern might be sea level rise because of the projections of 2 to 4 to 6 feet sea level rise over this century. And with 17,000 islands as part of your nation, a lot of people are going to be unhappy. A lot of people are going to be adversely affected, just as they are along California's coast. We see that, and currently in Florida today, we have a governor of Florida who's been a climate denier his entire political career until the hurricane hit. And all of a sudden he's concerned, and it's very serious, he's concerned about climate. Well, where has he been? But so moral persuasion is really, it's a value commitment. I think all human beings understand moral persuasion, but not all practice it.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's why actually oftentimes, frankly, I am not a religious person. I know my family's religion, but I'm not a religious person. But I do know that often theologians speak about our moral obligation to one another as human beings.
Okay.
So there's moral suasion, but meanwhile, if you have the moral persuasion, but you're not organized politically, you're not going to get your mandates, regulations, or incentives.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I think we will go to the next question, Prof. From Ms. Mutia Rahma.
Okay, thank you for chance, Ms. Uike. I have two questions for Mr. Daniel. Talk about the environmental issue. I think, can you hear my voice?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think our country in Indonesia and California have the same issues on forest fire. In our previous research about collaborative governance on in forest fire prevention in one of province in Indonesia, in South Sumatra, the most activities in just focus on emergency step. What about your country? Is there any strategy that we can learn from this issue in your country? And the second one is the cause of the most forest fire is generally stated to be man-made, especially the community around the forest. And also the plantation companies. How about this situation in California? Thank you.
It's an interesting question about forest fires in California. It's not just California, it's the West of the United States because of climate issues. and the history of forestry and being far less populated historically when we go back 2 centuries than it is today. But let me just say, the issue of forest fires in California, which you may have read about, have been very severe the last several years, were quite predictable. Indeed, forecast by those who study this for decades. And the reason is that the United States Forest Service was established in the early part of the 20th century to put out fires, because the people who were moving into these areas and settling, they wanted the wood. A lot of people got very rich on cutting down the trees.
Yeah.
But there were some horrendous fires that were started in what were natural groves at the time. And the U.S. Forest Service advocates that we needed something that was national actually went to our Congress and said, we will dedicate ourselves to putting out fires. Now we go ahead 100 years later, 2020, 2010, 2020. And what we have is a system in place that was built on putting out fires. Now, if you put out fires enough and more people move into the forest because it's very attractive if there's no fires, if you're in that area. California, Washington, Oregon, and in Canada also, along the West Coast, and now, in fact, even to what used to be hotter places that are burning, inland more. Anyway, all were built around this philosophy of putting out fires. That's not a viable, sustainable forest. Now, our University of California, I think I mentioned UCLA, but it's the University of California at Berkeley, has actually been doing the science of this in Northern California in some major plots that they have managed differently. Interesting story, because this was research. It's been going on for a long time. And what they found is that because we put out fires, that the undergrowth and the smaller trees shoot up and get very compacted. So that when you get a flame or a drought followed by a match or a lightning strike, there are about 1,400 lightning strikes just this summer in Northern California. Some of those end up in fires, forest fires. And that's a climactic effect, right? Forest fires, lightning rather than lightning, because they're very tall mountains. The storm comes in, hits those mountains, it interacts, shoot out electricity, and we have lightning strikes. So they can show you, they can demonstrate what a sustainable forest looks like. And then, complicating the picture in California, in order to save habitat and, like let's call it the owl, story of the owl, we banned cutting down trees. So the forestry went out of business in California. Very little commercially cutting of trees in California. So we drove out, first of all, we let the trees grow and we put out the fires. Second, we eliminated politically because we wanted to save the animals and the habitat, and we didn't want forests to be clear cut and they'd just scar the land. And selective cutting was not viable financially. Selective cutting is when you go in and you choose trees to cut, you thin the forest continuously and the undergrowth, because otherwise the people in Norway and Finland and Canada outbid American trees that were cheaper. So you're in a catch. Someone else will sell something to you cheaper than you can grow on your own. In any event, what happened was then when we had the climate change and the drought together, we're getting huge fires. But in fact, there is a science that is knowable in California by the University of California that shows how you can selectively manage it differently. And it has to do with thinning out, it has to do with protecting the older trees, has to do with selective cutting, which the lumber industry still argues is not profitable sufficiently to do it, so they leave the state. It's a real challenge, but I believe because of these fires of the last several years, we are going to go to the models that the Berkeley University research has demonstrated over time. Some of those big fires you mentioned went into some of the control plots of land and burned them down. And the adjacent plots of lands that were manicured differently and managed differently were not burned down. I mean, there's real good systematic data on managing forests effectively. But I want to come back, not profitably under the international market of wood right now. That's going to have to change. Once again, we don't have an international accord to coordinate this. But we don't even have an accord within the United States to coordinate it. So I don't want to say it's not international. But we have the state of California that's going to be doing that. Excuse me. So the answer is there are models. The Australians have been through this very severely. I don't know if you've looked at Australia, but they had the same kind of thing, drought fires.
Yeah.
They preceded California and finally figuring out you have to manage the land differently. But it's a huge issue. It's a huge issue. Is that sufficient as an answer?
How about that, Ms. Mutia? Is that sufficient for you?
Okay, thank you for your insight. Thank you, Ms. Vika.
Okay. So there is like one more question.
Okay.
Is that okay? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. To Angelina Camila Lalu. Hello, Angelina. Are you still here?
I think I am. I hit the wrong button. I'm going to try and come back very quickly. Oh my goodness, what have I done? What have I done?
But we still can see you, Prof.
You can see me. I can't see you, so I won't touch my screen any further because I might lose you, but ask the question and I will answer it.
Okay, Angelina, please, if you have question. Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Wike.
Mm-hmm.
Good morning, Prof. It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm quite curious about plastic usage and the risks of it. You know, in Indonesia, 9% of plastic waste, it is equivalent 600,000 enters the ocean annually. And from USAID, is a United States Agency for International Development, is one of the partners with the governments of Indonesia to strengthen the resilience of population, their communities and economy. And as we know that poor solid water from the plastic management poses a major risk to human health and the environment by polluting land, air, and the water bodies. And what I'm gonna ask you is about how to reduce plastic usage in Indonesia, or moreover in the world, based on your country or compared to your country about the policy and plastic usage. Thank you so much, Prof.
Plastic use is a big issue worldwide. In the I want different levels. There's a big push to eliminate single-use plastic bottles in the United States, various places. I mentioned my university, by the way, because we've just addressed that issue. As of this past summer, there was no single-use plastic available on campus, bottles or drinks, containers rather. How did we do that? The answer is we went to Coca-Cola. That's the major provider of foods, plastic bottles, but other kinds of drinks for our campus. We have a contract with them. We provide the space, we talk about what the price is going to be. And the university said, well, if we're going to be a sustainable university, we have to go to zero single-use plastics. And Coca-Cola said, well, you know, that's really not convenient for us, and we can make them cheaper, and people like the plastic. And we said, yeah, but they're not facing the consequences. Excuse me again. We're not facing the consequences. They are not facing the consequences of what's happening on our campus. So we used regulation. This last year, their contract was up for renewal, and there were other companies that would supply soft drinks and food and so forth to the campus. And we said to Coca-Cola, you know, if you want to go less plastic, we'll Signed a contract with you, we'll renew it. And there was a negotiation and they did it. Now, what was their incentive? First of all, others are starting to say the same thing. So we happen to convince them that we should be a good example of a major university banning single-use plastics.
Oh,
So there's a scale here and a power here and an economics here. Because the plastic is probably cheaper.
mhm.
The plastic is easy to move around physically. It's lighter than glass. But glass and aluminum are the only two really serious recyclable containers we use, unless you have a multi-use container yourself you carry around with you. But that goes along also, by the way, with an effort underway here in the United States, and it may not be as serious a problem elsewhere, of eating beef. Because beef cattle, the consumption of beef is the highest single carbon emitting food product, I think, in the United States widely.
Wow.
And it's 9% more carbon emitting than pork, pigs, or chickens. So there's an issue of dietary implications for climate change that we are dealing with and health. So the answer, by the way, coming back to the single-use bottle, is an organization large enough to affect a supplier. Because if you don't have enough people or businesses or your own university willing to say, we have a contract with you, you provide the goods, we give you shelf space, we let you sell on our campus, we do that, if you got to negotiate with them. And they know it's happening around the world. So you can't let them say, well, we can't do it. They can do it. It may cost more, or they may have to change their technology. But hey, we have to do a lot of that on this planet, because plastics on land, but in the oceans is awful. And it's affecting the habitat. I mentioned the ecological model. It's affecting the fishes in the oceans more than anything else. It's terrible also to burn for fuel in terms of emissions. So a lot of reasons not to have plastic. Now, I understand the challenge to that is the petrochemical industry. I don't want to be naive about that. The international petroleum sector has shifted a lot of its end use for petroleum into plastics. As they see in transportation, we're moving to electric vehicles. So I know they are trying to maintain a business model that keeps them wealthy and using their fossil fuel. So there's a big political issue. But if you organize locally, because you're not going to do it by yourself, you have a chance.
Okay. I think it's like 5 to 9 p.m. there. Is
Yes.
that right?
You're correct.
Yeah. And there's still like one more question, but I think I will ask you whether like you don't mind to have one more question, or that's
How about another question? We'll do that. As long as you have patience for it, I'll give you my 2 cents worth, as they say.
okay. Thank you so much. I think this will be the last question from Refandi.
Okay.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I'm very thankful for the opportunity that the host given to me. And excuse Professor Daniel, I would like to ask my question. So first, I have read about one of the oldest adages of the environmental movement, which is to think and plan globally, but act locally. And in my mind, I have a question that how do we or policymakers reach international awareness, participation, and even engagement in climate change issue, because countries in the world has their own interest, including Indonesia as developing countries, is in pursuing equality in wealth distribution, as long with growing the economic to grow rapidly. And I think the most efficient way is to increase in educational issues, that we give good education about green development to our young generations. But the problem is the effect of this educational purposes is long term, and in the other hand, we need to act now and not act later. So what is the not only preventive act that we can do, but also the repressive, what we can do now, what we can act now. And the secondly is about mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation, in my perspective, is reducing severeness of the climate change, and the adaptation is adapting about the current situation of the climate change. So yes, we as Indonesia, as developing countries, developing people, how do we catch up with the developed countries? And in the other hand, we have to develop our green development. So in one hand, we need to enhance, we need to pursue the developed countries. We need to pursue our equality equality of distribution of wealth in our country. But in the other hand, we need to act as a planet to save the earth, to reducing or adapting in the climate change issue. Thank you.
So you've touched on several hours worth of conversation now, but a few comments. It seems to me that you learn through doing. So you said education, but education alone has not been my answer for my university or for what I have tried to do personally. I think what you have to do is you have to motivate people through understanding the problem. That's why I started with the IPCC, by knowing the problem. But you have to have examples of how you can make a difference that are realistic. And one of the educational challenges to my university now is the policy that has been adopted by this presidential working group for the whole university, that not only do every student have to be literate in understanding the effects of climate change on what they do. I said it's all fields and disciplines, but the requirement that every student who graduates from this university has an actual experience in working with an entity or organization addressing this problem. We don't come close to doing that yet. But it's the educational goal that says it's the learning and doing together that matters. And, once you have some successes, of course, it grows. But you have to have some successes. I understand that too. And that's why I mentioned about the plastic bottles. If you have enough people in your community or your university, simply to say, the moral suasion is to get all the rest of the students to say, hey, we agree with you. We shouldn't be doing this. The mandate regulation side is to get your administration to say, we're going to negotiate with the providers and we're going to insist that they change how they carry and compact foods or drinks or liquids. And the incentive is maybe that you've got to find some way of keeping the price of that new way of transporting liquids so that it is not too much more costly than the old way. So you actually do all three. There's not a single answer. Change does not come by passing a law. Passing a law is talk. Passing a law is rhetoric. It's not bad to have it, but it's rhetoric if there's no follow-up. Implementation is critical, but implementation top down always gets resistance. So you need, particularly something that's important to this, bottom-up pressure that triggers mandates, but considers initiatives. I mentioned California is really well known for how we've done this. We have done this through having tough laws with real goals, but we incentivize business to do it or individuals to do it. And by the way, people like me who live in this state love the environment and what it's given us. So there is a moral part of this that we say this should be good for everybody, and we can't have it if we don't act collectively. There's not a single step here. There are the three things, and in every instance, it's what's the balance between using moral suasion. You use moral suasion alone by itself when there's no political support and it's too costly. Honestly, because how else are you going to get people to change? They morally think, I can't buy this less expensive bottle because it's plastic. I have to buy a glass or aluminum, at least they're recyclable, or I have to have my own container and refill it. But I'm not going to buy plastics anymore. That's moral suasion. Someone's decided they're going to go the extra step to do the right thing with no rewards that are financial and no mandate to do it. But that doesn't move many people. I promise you it doesn't move that many people. Not enough to make a difference on the planet. So we need mandates and regulation, which requires a governance system that is global in its reach for some things. Not everything has to be global in its reach, but carbon emissions needs to be under one big umbrella in its reach. And we think about, well, how do you incentivize people to make the change that is not in their self-interest? How do you get me out of my internal combustion engine to buy a more expensive EV so that we have less pollution in Los Angeles and less carbon in the atmosphere? That's the question. And if you tell me I should do it, I'd say, yeah, I know I should do it. If you tell me, Dan, if you don't do it, we're going to regulate you and you're going to have to do it. Well, you might even not be able to drive on the freeway. We give people incentives to drive on the freeway called a fast lane if they have EVs. We give a three-year sticker they can put on their car and they can drive in the fast lane without paying. I drive in the fast lane in my car. If it's a big, internal combustion, I've got to pay a lot of money to go in that fast lane. And it gets me someplace fast. I like that. So you have to mix these things. I'm just saying they're the three tools we have. We don't have anything more. And what's the mix of tools to get done what you want to get done?
How about Revandi? Is that sufficient enough for you?
Yes, it is sufficient. Thank you. And
okay, Prof. Daniel, I think we can hear your sharing for more hours and hours, but it's almost I think it's 3:09 over there, right?
No, it is.
No, 3 past
9.
3 past 9 over there. So actually there is 2 more questions, but I think we will let you go because it's.
I tell you what, if you have others have questions, they want to email me their questions, so we can exchange notes that way.
So for yeah. So if you still have, for all of the audience, if you still have questions for Prof. Daniel, you can email him in person. And I think thank you so much for your time, Prof. Daniel. We really appreciate your sharing to us.
Well, I appreciate you reaching out, and I think it is very important that this conversation takes place. So I don't mind this contributing to that, because it's your future. You can tell it's your future much more than mine. I'm showing you my white hair.
Thank you for walk the talk.
Okay.
I've ever visited your university, by the way, in 2016.
Did you really?
Yeah, because I used to study in New Jersey, and I visited my friend in USC, and it's a really beautiful campus.
Well, thank you for that, but we are changing our landscape.
Yeah, it's
no
really
longer going to be the manicured lawn. We're changing it. It's going to be drought resistant, indigenous plants, native plants. We're changing the landscape as part of being a more sustainable university. But it is beautiful. I know everybody says that. Okay, enough.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much for your time. And that's it. Good night.
Good night.
Have a good night. Yeah. Okay.